threw it out there, asked for your questions. What do you guys want to know about the defensive players in this class? And we got some good questions. So we're going to be able to tread a lot of territory here with the 2024 defensive player class, which I think is a notably interesting one. Lack of guys at the top, some of the positions that we're going to dig into. Let's start with a question from Evan Donovan, who said, "Hey, Robert and Diante, curious to know how many first-round difference makers Diante thinks are in this defensive class and how far they'll make it in the draft." So I want to focus on the first part of that question because I think it gets to the meat of the conversation about the defensive class in general. Dane doesn't have a defensive player in his top 10. Almost every single mock draft doesn't have a defensive player in the top 10. So as you're considering this and you're thinking about difference makers who could be available in the first round, how many would you count?
I'm really on the fringe with this. I would say 4 is where I'm at right now.
4.
And I probably wax and wane with whether or not it's actually 3. I think a lot of that is like my debate on what I think of Quinion Mitchell. And I would say he's probably the only corner in this class, pure corner in this class, that I would put in that kind of difference maker category. Cooper DeJean kind of being a hybrid. But I would say there's 4 that I would say solidly are guys I expect to be big time difference makers.
Who are the 4?
My 4 would be Cooper DeJean, who I mentioned, Quinion Mitchell, who I'm more on the positive side of, more optimistic side right now, Laiatu Latu as an edge, and then Dallas Turner as an edge. So 2 DBs and 2 edge rushers that I have solidly as difference makers, and then Byron Murphy and Johnny Newton as defensive tackles who are kind of on the fringe.
You did not say Terrion Arnold's name. He is the top corner in this draft to some people from Alabama. I think Dane has him at 10 on his big board. He has Mitchell at 11. So why do you think that Arnold isn't even in that conversation for you, let alone pushing Mitchell to be the top corner and for some people, the top defensive player in the entire draft?
Right. So Terrion Arnold is still a first round grade. I would say so. Like I obviously don't do big boards like Nate, like Dane, but he would probably be somewhere in that 14 to 16 range if I did one in terms of how I would rank prospects. I would say with Arnold, it's not an issue of him necessarily missing any one particular part of his game, right? I think he's extremely well-rounded. He's a guy who's versatile. You can probably play him in the slot if you needed to in certain packages, can definitely play well outside, good with press. The ball skills was really – this was probably the first year that we've seen that type of ball production with him at the catch point in terms of forcing turnovers and turning PBU opportunities into turnovers. But I don't necessarily see that number one, down in and down out, shutting down one side of the field, or those elite athletic traits that would maybe make up for the difference in what you haven't seen in production on tape yet. Quinion Mitchell, I think, kind of has him edged athletically in a way where I think I'd be a little bit more comfortable taking a chance on him as a difference maker than for Terrion Arnold.
Where are your concerns with Quinion Mitchell when you're saying that he's on the border for you in the difference maker category? What still gives you pause with him a little bit?
I would say a lot of it is tape, right? Like you're playing at Toledo, and it's not so much that you're playing up against MAC receivers, though that's obviously a consideration, as much as the defensive scheme that he played in. There's a lot of off coverage, a lot of soft zone, and you do see a lot of that in the league, right? So I'm not going to act like you can't translate one to the next. But when I think about difference-making corners, you think about Patrick Surtain II, right? You think about A.J. Terrell in Atlanta. These guys who are extremely long-armed, elite speed guys that you've seen play at the line of scrimmage, play up against top-level wide receivers year in and year out. And they not only, can take away routes vertically, but they make plays on the ball consistently year over year. And for me with Mitchell, I don't know if he necessarily meets that threshold for me where I would say, no doubt about it, top 10 player. If you need a defensive player, if you're in Atlanta, you can't let this guy get by you. I don't know if I have him there.
Do you have anyone there? Because the next question we have is from Garrett Dyer. And he said, is there a defensive prospect truly worth taking in the top 10 this year? I can't tell if it's the insane amount of potential quarterback, wide receiver, and tackle talent that's drowning out the potential Pro Bowl caliber talent at edge, cornerback, and defensive tackle. If the Falcons needed a guy on defense, is there one there, or would they be reaching for one at number 8?
I wouldn't say reaching. Like, I think, the easy mock for, I think, almost everybody in the pre-draft process has been just dropping Dallas Turner in. at 8 for them because they definitely they've had a need at edge basically since John Abraham retired. And they definitely would need one. I would think in Raheem Morris's defense, right? So I wouldn't say it's a reach to make that pick because I would say the most aspirational trajectories for a guy like Turner probably would merit taking that guy around 8 to 12. But what I would say is, like, if you're asking me in terms of grades, my top 4 guys, so Quinion Mitchell, Latu, Dallas Turner, Cooper DeJean, those are all top 15 type of grades, right? If you can get that guy in the teens, you probably feel really strong about getting value out of those players, guys who can make an impact pretty immediately and still have an upward trajectory in terms of development. There aren't, like I said, there isn't an AJ Terrell. There isn't a Patrick Surtain. There's not a Will Anderson in this class where you can sight unseen say, at worst, we are getting a solid to plus starter from day one with this guy, and we think that they can turn into all-pro talents. I don't know if there's an all-pro talent in this class, maybe outside of Cooper DeJean, if you believe the absolute best of him as a player.
Is this the most diluted defensive class you can remember at the top since you really started studying this?
I would say so. I would say that, and I hear, I'm listening to you and Dane and Nate talk about a lot of other positions in this class, right? Like, I think that in general with this draft, this is probably the most similarly graded between prospects at positions that I can remember in like my half decade or so, really paying attention to the NFL draft and evaluating players. I think there are a lot of guys that are kind of clustered together. This year, more than any, has been more about thresholds and tiers than it's been about finding top level players at each position, right?
On defense specifically.
On the defensive side of the ball,
yeah.
yes. Obviously, we know how we feel about quarterbacks, about receivers, about tackles. I would say defensively, this is probably as clustered a group of prospects, especially at premium positions, that I can remember. There's not a guy that I could turn on and say, hey, you're going to watch. All I need to do is show you a dozen clips, and you're going to turn off the tape and be like, I get it. We need that guy, right? There's not really a guy like that in this class.
It's funny. The other class I would go back to is 2021 is kind of like this. And the reason that comes to mind immediately is because the first true edge rusher to come off the board in the 2021 class was Jalen Phillips at 18. Micah Parsons went 12th, but there's a reason Micah Parsons went 12th. It's because people didn't know what to do with Micah Parsons in this process. When he got to Dallas, they were trying to make him a linebacker at the beginning. It took a while to finally figure it out. The difference is, I think both J.C. Horn and Patrick Surtain throughout the process were considered kind of lock top 10 talents. If you look at what Surtain was specifically at Alabama, I mean, he checked every single box. And part of the reason that Carolina can talk themselves into Horn above him is that the press traits were so impressive that you can convince yourself that there's a ceiling with him, where I think Surtain's selling point, especially pre-draft, was more about the floor, which is kind of funny now because he's a cyborg. But I think that was the conversation at the time, if I'm remembering it correctly.
I think that 2020 was probably a good example, a good reference point to draw back to, right? And what you think about in that class is the fact that you have Surtain and you have Parsons, right, as guys who separated themselves from the pack once they hit the pros. And everybody else, it's not that there were poor players in that draft, right? You would take a Jalen Phillips more often than you wouldn't if you knew what he would turn into once he hits the league, right? But nobody was making that pick with the thought that that was a guy that was going to turn into an all-pro, Pro Bowl level talent, right? And there's not a lot of guys, I think, that you're going to see teams put in press conferences together saying, hey, man, in 5 years, we're going to be talking about resetting the market with this player. And for us as analysts, I don't know if I'm looking at guys saying this is going to be the top paid edge rusher. This is going to be the top paid defensive back in 2028, 2029 when they're coming off their rookie deal.
You look at the defensive players taken after that stretch in 2021, it's not great, man. 16 was Zaven Collins to Arizona. 18, Jalen Phillips goes to Miami. 19, Jamin Davis goes to Washington. 21, Kwity Paye to the Colts. 22, Caleb Farley to the Titans. 26, Greg Newsome goes to the Browns. Like, that's one of the hits in this group. Is a slot receiver or a slot corner who's played pretty well. After that, we got Peyton Turner, Eric Stokes. Greg Rousseau is kind of similar. Greg Rousseau went 30th, just a guy who's been on the field and played. Odafe Oweh was fine last year, but he's not somebody that is in that upper tier of players at his position. Joe Tryon-Shanka. So it is kind of another example outside of those maybe top 2 guys where it's a little bit diluted in the back half of the first tier into the second and third tier.
And it's funny looking at that now, right? So some of those teams, when I think about this year in in defensive prospects in the draft, the Saints need to go get another edge rusher because Peyton Turner didn't hit, right?
Yes.
The Bills went out and paid Von Miller because they weren't getting production out of their edge rushers, the picks that they had made at the edge position.
Even the Dolphins traded for Bradley Chubb.
Exactly. The Ravens go and get Clowney and Van Noy because Odafe Owe, while a great rotational player, doesn't hit and give you the value that you're looking for right out the gate. And Joe Tryon-Shoyinka is basically losing his reps to Yaya Diaby and the guys that they just drafted last year, right? And there's not a lot of clarity on how he's going to break into the rotation going forward. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of that in this class. And then what I would say that makes it really interesting for the 2024 draft is this is maybe like the hardest line I've drawn in a class where it's like after maybe pick 45, pick 50, you better have a very clear idea of a role you're trying to fit for these guys because you're probably not going to sneak into a third rounder that turns into a perennial Pro Bowl type of player. I think there's a pretty clear threshold in this draft on day 2 for where you can get a guy that you feel good about making an impact, and the rest of it is going to be depth and role player type.